Have you ever stopped to think how a simple 14-year-old boy could change the destiny of hundreds of adult soldiers, armed to the teeth, trained and hardened by war? The night was so dark, it seemed to swallow the trees. The smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke entered the nostrils like poison. The earth vibrated with each step of the enemy, and there, hidden behind a fallen trunk, an American soldier, covered in blood, dirt and sweat, tried to control his breathing as he watched 300 enemy soldiers advance like a living wall. They came in absolute silence, organized, relentless, as if nothing in the world could stop them. Each movement of those men created a dry, calculated, cruel, metallic sound. It was like watching a tide of death approaching, and you being trapped on a sinking island. The soldier knew there was no way out. There were no reinforcements, no ammunition, no hope. He had already seen friends fall one by one, screaming, pleading, disappearing into the darkness. And now it was his turn. His hands trembled so much that the rifle slipped. His legs no longer responded. He rested his head against the trunk, closed his eyes, and awaited the inevitable impact. But before giving up, he murmured a phrase that seemed too absurd to make sense in that chaotic scenario. Everything started because of that boy. And this is where the story takes a completely unexpected turn, because you, like any adult in that troop, would never imagine that the person responsible for messing with the minds of 300 experienced soldiers, the person who orchestrated the biggest psychological blow of that operation, the person who transformed a shameful defeat into a historic turnaround, wasn't a commander, wasn't a sniper, wasn't a decorated hero. He was a Boy Scout, 14 years, carrying an old backpack, a pocket knife, and a notebook full of scribbles that nobody paid any attention to. And while the enemies advanced, believing they had won, none of them could. Imagine that they were marching exactly where that boy wanted them to go. The entire forest at that moment seemed to breathe the plan he had created. A plan that, if it worked, would be remembered for decades. And if it failed, well, no one would survive to tell the story. But how could a teenager confound 300 professional soldiers? How could someone so small create something so big? And why could this soldier, on the verge of death, only think about himself? That's what you're about to find out. And what comes next is so improbable that, if it weren't recorded, many people would call it a lie. But it happened, and it happened in a way that no general could have predicted. Because when the improbable awakens, not even 300 soldiers can escape. Did you realize how a simple 14-year-old boy might have been the sole reason hundreds of soldiers survived that night? Before continuing this story, which only gets more intense, if this type of content captivates you and makes you think, subscribe and like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And feel free to comment on which city and country you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach. Miguel never imagined that one day he would be in the middle of a real war. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't wear a uniform. He had no training. He was just a 14-year-old boy with small hands and eyes too big for such a cruel world. But there, in the biting cold of that forest, he had known since he was 6 years old. It was impossible not to feel the weight of everything that was happening. The explosions made the ground tremble beneath his feet, as if the earth had a desperate heart beating without stopping. And despite the fear burning in his chest, Miguel continued in silence, carrying that old backpack where he kept everything he owned, a canteen, a yellowed notebook, a piece of rope, and the pocket knife that had belonged to his grandfather. What no one knew was that this boy had already seen more pain than many grown men. Miguel had lost his mother early, and his father had disappeared in some conflict far away, leaving the boy in the care of his grandfather, a lumberjack who made the forest his home. Growing up in that harsh environment, Miguel learned to listen to the sounds of the forest, to interpret signs that would go unnoticed by any trained soldier. A leaf falling out of rhythm with the wind, a footstep too light, the strange silence of the birds, warning of danger. It was as if nature spoke to him, and he listened. But now, in the midst of the war, nothing made sense. The noise was constant, deafening, a metallic roar that swallowed all hope. The soldiers accompanying him were exhausted, wounded, many of them trembling with cold and fear. Miguel felt their tension as if it were his own, as if each desperate look demanded answers he didn't have. At least, not yet. With each step, He wondered what he was doing there. Why a boy? Why him of all people? But at the same time, a part of him knew that running away wasn't an option. He felt something growing inside his chest. Not courage, but responsibility. He knew that forest better than anyone. He knew where the ground dipped, where the sound echoed, where the mist naturally formed at dawn. He knew what could be used and what should be avoided. It was as if all the little things he had learned from his grandfather were suddenly connecting. Every lesson, every injury, every night sleeping on the cold ground, every trail he had followed alone. Everything seemed to prepare him for that moment. Meanwhile, the soldiers around him simply ignored him. They thought he was there by accident, a lost child someone had decided to protect. Some even laughed behind his back, muttering that he was more of a hindrance than a help. But Miguel listened to everything in silence. He always listened. It was what he did best. Observe, listen, understand, and then act. He never had the luxury of being noisy. He had grown up learning that those who talk too much don't listen enough, and those who don't listen die. It was precisely by listening that he realized what no one else had noticed. A strange pattern in enemy behavior, an abnormal silence between shots, fresh footprints in directions that didn't match the official routes, the smell of smoke coming from the wrong side of the wind. The enemy troops weren't moving like an organized group. They were hunting, and not just hunting anything, hunting them. At that moment, a lump formed in Miguel's throat. He observed the American soldiers, all exhausted, many wounded, with empty stares that tried to disguise their terror. They were trained men, yes, men who risked their lives daily, but they were also tired, defeated men, without the strength to perceive the obvious. Miguel swallowed hard. He couldn't expect any of them to realize what he had just understood. He couldn't expect some sergeant to shout a miraculous order. He couldn't expect salvation to come from above. If anything were to be done, it would have to be done by him. That's when something changed in the boy's gaze. It wasn't sudden courage, it was necessity. He knew that if he wanted to live, and if he wanted to save those people who didn't even respect him, he needed to think fast. The forest, that old silent friend, was his only ally, and it still spoke to him, even in the midst of war. The wind whispered through the leaves. The shadows danced in the way they only danced when someone passed by. Miguel felt a shiver down his spine. Not of fear, but of understanding. A plan began to form. A plan too crazy for an adult to invent. A plan too simple for a soldier to take seriously. A plan that no one, absolutely no one, could expect to come from a boy. As the soldiers continued marching in the wrong direction, unaware that they were marching to their own deaths, Miguel stopped. He looked around. He felt the ground. He knelt. He touched the earth with his fingertips. His heart was racing, but his thoughts were clear. He knew exactly what he needed to do, and he knew that if it worked, the result would be so absurd that no one would believe him if he told them. But before moving a single branch, Miguel asked himself the question that would define everything. If I don't do it, who will? It was with this question weighing heavily on his chest that he took the first step in creating the scheme that would confuse 300 soldiers and change the fate of everyone in C, that forest. Miguel felt his heart race as he watched the soldiers advance in the wrong direction, completely oblivious to the danger surrounding them. The enemy was too close. The distance between them decreased with each passing second, and yet no one noticed. No one except the boy. The wind shifted direction, and with it came the smell of churned-up earth, a clear sign of recent movement. But the adult soldiers noticed nothing. They had no time, no energy, no sensitivity. In that kind of war, those who survived were those who saw what no one else saw. And however absurd it seemed, at that moment, the only one who could see was Miguel. But that wasn't enough. Knowing wasn't sufficient. He needed to act, and act fast. The boy's mind began to work as if all the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. The afternoon spent hunting with his grandfather, the endless trails through the dense forest, the animal tracks he had learned to decipher since he was little, the false footprints left to confuse predators, the natural traps he set just for fun. All of this suddenly was part of a single purpose, to deceive trained men as if they were lost prey. Miguel knew the enemies were tracking footprints. That was how they hunted. That was how they surrounded. They moved as if they were reading a book, And now, by chance or irony of fate, that book was in the hands of a boy who understood the forest better than any soldier. He stared at the ground for a few seconds. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He had no weapons, no explosives, no technology, but he had something none of them had: intimacy with the earth. Then he takes a deep breath, kneels down, and begins. The trick was too simple for any adult to take seriously, and at the same time too complex to be perceived by eyes trained for war, not nature. Miguel began to reverse footprints, literally making them point in the opposite direction from where the troop had gone. That alone would confuse any experienced tracker. But he wants to go further. He cuts tree branches with his pocket knife, leaving them angled in the wrong direction, simulating human movement. He scratches the surface of some stones to make it look like boots had scraped there. He crushes leaves where no one had stepped. He creates small mounds of earth as if someone had run hurriedly. And the most brilliant of all, he redraws the ground so that it looks like a large group is escaping in another direction. All this in minutes. Fast. Precise. Silent. The plan was almost childish, and precisely for that reason no one would ever imagine it could work. Soldiers think like soldiers. Generals think like generals. Human tracks think like human tracks. But a boy thinks like the forest, and the forest thinks differently. When he finishes, Miguel stands up. His hands tremble. His chest burns. His mind races in a whirlwind of doubts. What if it doesn't work? What if the trackers are better than he imagines? What if it all ends? Right there. But time is up. The enemy is coming. Miguel runs back to the group. No one asks where he was. No one asks what he did. No one notices his fixed, tense, sharp gaze, sharper than ever before. They just keep walking, believing that danger is still far away. But the danger at that moment was exactly where Miguel wanted it to be. Minutes later, when the first enemy trackers reach the area where Miguel intervened, silence reigns. They crouch, analyze the ground. They exchange signals with each other. They observe the branches, the crushed leaves, the reversed tracks. The entire enemy adjusts its posture, changes course, makes a wide turn, and disappears into the false direction constructed by a 14-year-old boy. And then something happens that no one would expect. The American soldiers, without understanding why, feel the air grow lighter. The sound of footsteps behind them disappears. The echo of enemy boots vanishes. The silence that was once a threat is now a relief. And no one knows why. No one, except that boy walking ahead, his breathing heavy and his heart pounding in his chest, trying to process what he has just done. Miguel doesn't smile. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't relax. He knows this was only the beginning. The enemy is still there, confused but alive, and at some point they will realize they were deceived. When that happens, they will return stronger, angrier, with more men, more dogs. But at that precise moment, in the middle of the forest, with night falling and fear creeping into the soldiers' souls, a boy saved them all without them realizing it. And that's precisely what fuels Miguel's fear. If he managed to fool an entire troop, how many more times will he have to do it before someone listens to him? Before someone believes him? Before someone realizes that the battalion's only chance of survival depends on a plan born from the mind of a boy? The war has barely begun for him, and the enemy still didn't understand that, on that day, he wasn't facing soldiers. He was facing the forest, and the forest had chosen Miguel as its voice. As soon as the enemy strayed from the true path, blindly following the false trail created by a 14-year-old boy, something shifted within Miguel. He felt a shock run through his body, not of pride but of responsibility. It was like discovering you could move a gigantic piece with the slightest touch, like realizing that in a game where everyone was a pawn, he had just acted as someone manipulating the entire board. But the feeling wasn't light. It was heavy, dense, suffocating, because now he knew if it had worked once, it would have to work again, and again, and again, until everyone got out of that forest alive. Time passed, and the soldiers continued walking, exhausted, wounded, staggering. None of them had the slightest idea of the magnitude of what had just happened. Miguel observed each face. No one noticed, no one suspected. For them, the sudden change in silence was simply luck, a pause in the pursuit, the breathable air of a less cruel night. But Miguel knew the truth. They were only alive because he decided to kneel on the ground and change some of the tracks. And that was just the beginning. Hours later, while the troop tried to rest in a narrow clearing, Miguel heard again the distant sound of enemy footsteps, the same organized rhythm, the same metallic cadence, the same hunting hunger. He felt a chill run down his spine. They were coming back. They were angry, and they were coming fast. The boy looked around, wounded men groaning, others sleeping from exhaustion, some trying to clean makeshift wounds, some quietly discussing the lack of ammunition, water, and food. How could he tell them that if he didn't act again, everyone there would be dead in minutes? Before he could think better, Miguel was already on his feet. He grabbed his pocket knife, took a deep breath, and walked away silently. Fear gripped his stomach like an invisible hand. But he continued. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a leader. He didn't have the authority to give orders. But he was certain of one thing. If I did nothing, nobody would. The forest opened up to him like an old friend. Miguel ran to a strategic point and began the process again. This time faster, more precise, more calculated. He knew exactly where the enemy would look for tracks. He knew which tree they would observe first. He knew how they would interpret each mark. Then Miguel built another, false trail, more elaborate. He drew a path that suggested the group had split up. He created deep footprints as if someone were carrying weight. He simulated a desperate run towards a dangerous valley. The crushed leaves, the broken branches, the marks on the ground. Everything seemed natural. When he finished, his breathing was ragged, his chest burned, and his knees trembled. But he knew he needed to get out of there before the enemy arrived. And it arrived. A few minutes later, Miguel watched hidden among the dense bushes as the enemy trackers stopped and knelt to examine the ground. They spoke quietly, gesturing with their hands. One seemed confused, another pointed to the side. A third stood up, took a few steps, and crawled to examine a broken branch. Then, as if a silent agreement had been reached, they all followed the false trail, exactly as Miguel had wanted. And so it was repeated. Once, then another one, then another one. The enemies were walking in circles, further and further away from the group of soldiers they were trying to capture, deeper and deeper into the unfamiliar forest, increasingly exhausted, frustrated, and full of doubt. That's when something unexpected started to happen. The American soldiers, even without realizing what Miguel was doing, began to notice that the enemy seemed lost. The sounds of the pursuit weakened. The voices became more distant. The tension decreased. And slowly, in the whispered conversations between them, an absurd theory emerged. There's something in this forest. They're afraid to go in. It's as if there's someone or something guiding us. But the real change occurred on the enemy's side. The troops that had once advanced with confidence now hesitated. The trackers grew irritated. They began to disagree amongst themselves. Some soldiers swore they had seen shadows moving. Others said they heard footsteps, voices, branches breaking when there was nothing there. Panic began like a small ember, and Miguel would turn it into a wildfire. Within a few days, the enemy had gone around in circles following false trails so many times that they began to believe they were being hunted by an elite group, perhaps a hidden unit, perhaps a clandestine battalion, perhaps something even more sinister. The name that began to circulate among them was almost superstitious: the Ghost of the Forest. They didn't know that the ghost was 14 years old, had messy hair, and carried an old notebook where he scribbled ideas during his brief rest time. Each trick left Miguel more exhausted, more bruised, more tense, but also more aware that he was carrying something bigger than himself. What had begun as improvisation was now transforming into a psychological weapon. The enemy was not only disoriented, I was scared, and fear in war is worth more than any bullet. But the more trouble he caused, the higher the price the war began to exact from him, and soon, very soon, the enemy would realize they weren't facing an invisible troop, but a single boy. And when they discovered this, they would send everything they had to hunt him down. That time was approaching, and Miguel could already feel it in the air, like he senses the rain before the clouds appear. Miguel's tricks were successful for days, days in which he barely slept, ate properly, and hardly spoke to anyone. With each new sign of the enemy approaching, he would disappear into the forest and return with his boots covered in dirt, his hands scratched, and his eyes even more tired. The American soldiers began to suspect the coincidence. Whenever the boy disappeared, the pursuit lessened. Whenever he returned, silence settled around the group. Some began to look at Miguel with silent respect, others with fear, but no one asked anything, perhaps because no one was ready to hear the answer. The enemy, on the other hand, no longer accepted the idea that they were being deceived by an invisible unit. They began to take notes, draw improvised maps and track patterns that shouldn't exist. And that's when one of the trackers noticed something that would change everything. The marks were too perfect to have been left by a large group. Different footprint profiles had equal depths, exact spacing and repeated inclinations. It was the work of a single person. This time, the problem wasn't that Miguel had been discovered. The problem was who he had discovered it. One of the enemy trackers was a specialist, a man, trained to hunt humans, not animals. A man who had read entire wars through the mud, and when he realized that a single individual was deceiving entire troops, something ignited within him, a mixture of irritation, wounded ego, and a desire for victory. He decided he wouldn't rest until he found that ghost, and so the hunt began. It was no longer a chase. It was an entire operation mounted to capture a single human being. Sniffer dogs, advanced beaters, snipers positioned at high points, armed, men walking in absolute silence, signals on the radio, new strategies. Miguel sensed the change before anyone else did. It was like the wind before the storm. The forest seemed tense, compressed, restless. He heard branches breaking where no one should have been. He smelled the dogs. He saw shadows too large and too fast to be wild animals. The ghost had become the main target. That night, Miguel tried to create another false trail, but everything seemed different. He was already too weak. His body trembled. His stomach ached with hunger. His head throbbed. Worse, there was dried blood on the side of his shirt, from a cut he didn't even remember getting. His breathing was short. He felt heavy, slow, vulnerable. The forest no longer responded as before. It was in this state that the first tragedy almost occurred. He was crouched down, retracing his steps, when he heard the dry thud of a gun being cocked. The sound came from behind. He turned and saw, a few meters away, the silhouette of an enemy soldier aiming directly at his head. It was too late to run, too late to think, too late to breathe. The figure raised the weapon, and Miguel could only think of his grandfather, the wooden house, the nights gazing at the stars. That's when the shot rang out, but it didn't hit him. A thick tree, felled years before by lightning, absorbed the bullet. Miguel felt the impact vibrate in the trunk, and he didn't think. He just ran. He ran without looking back, hearing gunshots, branches, snapping, screams in another language. He ran until his lungs burned. He ran until his body collapsed. That was the first miracle, and he knew it. In the following days, the hunt only got worse. The dogs got close enough to smell him. One of them almost caught him, growling furiously, before Miguel managed to lose them by crossing an icy stream. He stood still in the water for almost an hour, trembling, afraid to move, breathing so slowly that he felt pain in his chest. When he finally got out, he was on the verge of hypothermia. Once again a sniper nearly hit him. The bullet passed so close that it tore a piece of bark from the tree he was leaning against. He fell to the ground, covered in leaves, unsure if he was alive or dead for the first few seconds. The war was beginning to exact its price for every trick that had worked before. The American soldiers also began to notice the boy's condition. He was staggering. His skin was pale, trembling. He could barely stand. Yet, when they heard the distant metallic echo of enemy boots, Miguel would disappear again, determined to continue deceiving them, even if it cost him his own life. It was during one of these escapes that Miguel suffered the worst accident of all. He slipped on a moss-covered slope and fell from a height that, for a 14-year-old boy, could have been fatal. He rolled among rocks, branches, and roots until he stopped in a mud puddle. The impact took the air out of his body. He lay motionless, feeling sharp pains in his ribs. For minutes he thought he wouldn't be able to get up. He thought it was all over. He thought that forest, which had protected him so many times, had finally swallowed him whole. But then he heard. Not the enemy, not dogs, no shots fired. He listened to the forest, the sound of the wind. The leaves are dancing, natural silence, the silence that only existed when danger was far away. It was as if the forest was saying, "Get up," and Miguel stood up, trembling, crying, with pain in every part of his body, but he stood up. From that day on, he was no longer just the boy who tricked soldiers. He was someone who barely survived, always a hair's breadth above death. And the enemy, increasingly frustrated, increasingly tired, increasingly nervous, was about to discover the whole truth, because the hunt was not yet over. But Miguel didn't either. Miguel was no longer the same boy who had entered the forest days before. His steps were heavier, his breath shorter, his body covered in scratches, bruises, and dried dirt. But there was something even deeper, a kind of inner silence, as if he were keeping all the pain to himself, protecting others with what remained of his own strength. Each trick he created cost him a part of his energy, a fraction of his hope, a piece of his innocence. The enemy, now aware that they were fighting a single person, intensified the pursuit as never before. It was no longer a common operation, it was an obsession. They felt humiliated, ridiculed, ashamed for having been deceived by someone who wasn't even a soldier. The chief tracker, that man with the cold and merciless gaze, vowed to capture the ghost personally, and not alive. The enemy troops were no longer walking, they were hunting. They advanced with a precision that made the ground seem to tremble. They divided into 3 groups, each responsible for cutting off possible escape routes. They sent in highly trained dogs, accustomed to finding even wounded men buried under snow. They assigned 2 snipers exclusively to monitor the areas where Miguel moved most. They knew the boy had movement patterns, and they were ready to exploit them. For the first time since the beginning, Miguel felt real fear. Not simple, natural, instinctive fear, but a fear that paralyzes, that strangles thought, that threatens to extinguish the light within someone. A fear that says, "This time, there's no way out." But he continued, not because he believed he would survive, but because he knew that if he stopped, the American soldiers would be caught immediately. He needed to buy hours, maybe minutes, maybe just seconds. Any time he could buy would be enough to save someone. The boy then plunged into the forest once more, but his mind was sluggish. He knew what he needed to do, another false trail, but the details eluded him. His vision blurred. His hands trembled too much to hold the knife. He tried to cut branches, but his fingers slipped. He tried to reverse the tracks, but fell to his knees. His body had reached its limit. It was at that moment that he heard the barking. Loud, close, hungry. The dogs finally found him. Miguel jumped back, stumbling over roots. One of the dogs lunged forward first, a shepherd trained to take down targets without hesitation. He came running with the force of a missile. The distance between them decreased in a second that lasted an eternity. Miguel turned to run, but his body wouldn't respond. His legs gave way. He fell, face down on the ground. The first dog leaped, and at the exact instant it was about to sink its teeth into him, a sound echoed. A gunshot. The dog fell sideways, sliding across the ground. Miguel didn't see who fired, but that shot saved his life. It could have been an American soldier. It could have been luck. It could have been the forest trying to protect him once again. He didn't know. He only knew he needed to keep going. But now there was no more time for complex tricks. He needed to create something so absurd, so risky, so unimaginably daring that it could delay the enemy quickly enough. That's when he had the most dangerous idea of all. Miguel limped up a small hill covered in dry leaves. From the top he could see a narrow valley below, a natural passage where even a small group of soldiers would be vulnerable. He realized that if he could make the enemy believe the Americans had passed through there, they would enter the valley and be trapped for hours trying to get out. It would be the perfect time for the group to escape. But there was a problem. To create this convincing illusion, Miguel needed to expose himself completely. He needed to leave real traces. He needed to run, stumble, drag his feet. He needed to pretend it was a whole group rushing past in desperation. And even worse, he had to do it knowing that snipers were watching. Every step he took was a life-threatening risk. Every move was a possible outcome. Each shadow was an enemy, pointing a weapon. Miguel started running, or something resembling running. His legs barely responded, but he persisted. He dragged his feet, knocked over branches, stepped on loose stones, left intense marks on the ground. He used what little air he had to feign running. He feigned panic. He feigned a complete escape. And just when the last sequence of tracks ended, the shot rang out. Not one, but three. The bullets cut through the air like metallic snakes. One grazed his leg. The pain burned so quickly, it almost knocked him down. But Miguel didn't scream. He knew that if he screamed, they would find him. Blood trickled down his leg, hot and heavy. But he kept going. One step, another, another. The fourth bullet hit the ground beside him, kicking up earth. He felt the impact vibrate through his body. The world was spinning, the air disappeared. He staggered, dizzy, almost falling. That's when the real miracle happened. A clap of thunder, sudden, loud, violent. The clouds closed in like doors, being slammed shut. The wind blew fiercely, and in seconds a torrential rain fell upon the forest, washing away tracks, erasing marks, confusing dogs, blinding snipers, and creating a natural curtain between Miguel and his pursuers. The rain saved his life. The rain washed away the path. The rain swallowed the boy. Miguel fell to his knees, exhausted, bleeding, breathing with difficulty, but alive. And while the enemy shouted orders, lost in the storm, Miguel crawled away, each movement a desperate fight against death. That was the price of greatness, the price only he could pay. The storm that saved Miguel that night wasn't just rain, it was change. It was the moment when the war, for the first time, seemed to understand that this boy wasn't an accident nor a coincidence, but a decisive element, an outlier, a piece that should never have been there, and that, precisely for that reason, would change everything. When the next day dawned, the forest seemed like a different world. Dense fog hid the tree trunks, the smell of wet earth dominated the air, and the ground was so soaked that any trace seemed to have evaporated with the storm. The enemy, confused, frustrated, and tired, was unable to reorganize the pursuit. Some soldiers believed that the so-called ghost controlled the weather, others that they were facing a curse of the forest. There were those who swore they heard footsteps, voices, calls, shadows moving among the trees. The psychology of fear had already won for Miguel. Meanwhile, the boy crawled through the mud toward his group. Every movement was a profound suffering. His leg was bleeding, his ribs were throbbing, his body trembled from the cold and exhaustion. But, despite everything, there was a flame in his chest. He had succeeded. For the first time since the persecution began, he felt that something had truly changed. When the American soldiers found him, Miguel was nearly unconscious, leaning against a rock, his face pale and his eyes, too, sunken for his age. They rushed to him. The sergeant knelt down, placed his hand on his shoulder, and for the first time saw in that boy not a burden, but the reason they were all still alive. "Boy, what have you done?" whispered the sergeant, startled, impressed, almost in disbelief. Miguel didn't answer. He couldn't. The only thing he did was try to stand up and fail. His body couldn't take it anymore. One of the soldiers carried him in his arms, and there had never been such respectful silence as in that moment. It wasn't a silence of fear nor of chaos. It was a silence of reverence. As the troops moved away from the valley, regaining ground and reorganizing their forces, stories began to circulate. And the further they walked, the more the rumor grew. At first it was just whispered talk. That boy, he tricked them. Then it turned into admiration. He saved everyone, all by himself. And then it became a myth. It was him. The ghost is a boy. The climax came when the battalion managed to reach a safe position, well beyond enemy reach. Within hours, the information spread to different units. Officers who had never seen Miguel spoke of him as if he were an elite soldier. Commanders who had never set foot in the forest tried to understand how a boy had accomplished what trained groups had failed to do in weeks. And far away, on the other side, the enemy made an important decision. Stop the chase. After so many days of being deceived, humiliated, and tormented by impossible trails, they concluded that it was no longer worth wasting men and ammunition confronting that invisible being. They retreated, and in the enemy unit's official report, it was recorded. Pursuit called off due to the presence of an unknown, highly trained individual who was impossible to track. A 14-year-old boy. Unknown, no patent, without a weapon, without training. Described as highly trained. That was the legacy. In the following days, Miguel recovered slowly. His leg was treated in the improvised way that war allowed. His ribs still ached when he breathed. But what was most surprising was not his physical resilience. It was his silence. He didn't talk about what he had done. He didn't accept praise. He didn't seek recognition. He just observed, he just breathed. He just existed as he always had. Small, simple, invisible. Then came the final moment, the one that separates a myth from a real hero. When the war in that region ended, an officer tried to give Miguel a medal. The boy looked at it, held it carefully as if picking up something precious, and gave it back. "I only did what I could," he said softly. The officer insisted. The soldiers cheered. But Miguel, shy, firm, and sincere, simply gestured his refusal. He didn't want to become a symbol. He didn't want to carry the weight of something that, in his mind, had only been a necessity. He just wanted to go home, to his grandfather, to the forest trails, to the silence he always understood better than any human voice. And he returned. He walked slowly along the dirt road, still limping, the backpack on his back, the same pocket knife in his pocket, the same notebook full of scribbles, the same simplicity, the same boy. But the world would never be the same after him. For decades, official reports will mention the unknown element. Historians will try to understand how 300 soldiers were confused by false footprints. Experts will discuss the psychological phenomenon that devastated enemy morale in that campaign. And many military personnel will continue to believe that it was all the work of a secret unit. They would never imagine that, behind it all, there was just a Boy Scout, Miguel, a boy who overcame the impossible and returned home as if nothing had happened. After all this, what did you learn from the story of this 14-year-old boy who became the ghost capable of confusing 300 soldiers? Every detail of his journey shows how courage, intelligence, and the will to survive can come from the most unlikely places. And now I want to know from you, which part of this story impacted you the most? Leave a comment below. It's always amazing to see how each person absorbs something differently. If this content touched you in any way, if it made you think about the strength that exists even in the smallest and most silent things, leave your comment, enrollment, and the like. That's great. This really helps the channel grow and allows more people to discover inspiring stories like this one. And that's all for now, because the next video will bring an even more powerful story.